Design for the margins, a reflection. Whose comfort counts? Designing library policies around trans and non-binary people of color. If public libraries were designed first for trans and non-binary people of color, who use them as both refuge and a risk-laden space, core assumptions about safety, professionalism, and even neutrality would have to shift. Instead of treating safety as an individual problem to be solved with good behavior and personal resilience, libraries would be forced to confront how whiteness, gender norms, and colonial governance are already built into everyday rules about who belongs, who is watched, and whose discomfort matters. Now, centering this group makes visible how current systems ask those most targeted by harassment, surveillance, and misrecognition to do the heaviest emotional and physical labor of quote-unquote fitting in. Current systems fail trans and non-binary people of color at multiple levels. At the level of formal policy, codes of conduct, and so-called customer service expectations are framed as neutral, but often operate to recenter white comfort and binary gender norms, policing whose bodies and expressions are seen as disruptive or out of place. Staff are authorized to intervene when other patrons feel uncomfortable. A category that is rarely unpacked but is frequently racialized and gendered. Trans and racialized patrons become the ones asked to move, quiet down, or justify their presence, while those doing the complaining remain unnamed as the producers of harm. This then echoes Week 3's insight that whiteness functions as an institutional norm by default, defining what counts as professional behavior and legitimate emotion, and that inclusion fails when those norms stay intact. Service and spatial design layer add additional barriers. Many libraries still rely on highly visible open floor plans and security practices that prioritize monitoring over privacy, which can feel exposing for anyone whose gender expression is constantly read and misread. Washrooms are often strictly gendered, or where universal or gender-neutral options exist are very few and poorly signed or located in less accessible areas, making every bathroom trip a calculation about safety and the risk of being challenged. Feminist work on the Lady Bountiful and Mommy Librarian archetypes further complicates this picture. White feminized care and benevolence are framed as natural, while staff of color and trans staff are expected to perform the same exact emotional labor with less institutional protection or authority. In this context, then, trans and non-binary patrons of color encounter a service model that simultaneously demands their trust and continually misrecognizes them. Designing first for trans and non-binary people of color would mean reimagining library policy and space around collective safety rather than white comfort. One concrete design shift would be to adopt a harm reduction service model embedded in policy, spatial design, and staffing. At the policy level, we have, instead of generic respectful behavior codes that are enforced unevenly, libraries would implement an anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policies that explicitly name trans misogyny, racism, homophobia, and xenophobia, and commit the institution to intervening in patron-on-patron harassment. This would include clear, widely posted procedures for what happens when somebody is misgendered, followed, or verbally attacked, alongside accountability mechanisms that do not require the targeted person to repeatedly retell their experience to be believed. Following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's insistence on material, auditable commitments rather than vague values, these policies would be tied to training requirements, evaluation metrics, and reporting structures that can be monitored over time. Spatially designing for this group would mean treating privacy and bodily autonomy as core access needs rather than optional extras. Washroom design, for example, would prioritize fully accessible all-gender facilities as the default rather than an exception, and wayfinding would make these spaces easy to locate without having to ask staff. Seating, study rooms, and quiet areas would have to be arranged to offer sightlines and exits that allow those who are frequently surveilled to choose where to sit without feeling trapped or constantly visible. Drawing on feminist critiques of feminization as a technology of governance, the goal would be to shift from spaces organized around being monitored and helped by staff to spaces organized around patrons' own ability to manage risks, choose proximity, and exit uncomfortable situations. Staff and training would also have to change. A harm reduction model requires that staff be evaluated not only on efficiency or friendliness, but on their capacity to interrupt harassment, reflect on their own positionality, and share power with patrons whose experiences differ from theirs. Week 3's emphasis on decentering whiteness suggests that hiring more diverse staff without transforming the white professional norms will only reproduce assimilation pressures. Designing for trans and non-binary people of color would instead require shifting which competencies are valued and who is seen as an expert on safety and inclusion. This might mean creating paid advisory roles for trans and non-binary community members, compensating them for their expertise in shaping policy, space, and service design, and ensuring they have real decision-making authority rather than purely symbolic presence. Thinking with Week 5's discussion of decolonization as not just a metaphor also complicates this design work. Tuck and Yang insist that decolonization is about land, life, and sovereignty, not simply institutional reform. For trans and non-binary people of color who may also be indigenous, undocumented, or otherwise targeted by the state, a truly inclusive library cannot stop at internal policy changes. It must examine how its practices around records, surveillance, and collaboration with police or authority figures or immigration authorities affect those whose safety is already precarious. Designing for the margins here would mean scrutinizing data collection and sharing, reconsidering security partnerships, and aligning harm reduction policies with commitments to Indigenous and other community-led governance, not only with institutional branding. As I did with assignment 1, this mapping ultimately raises a lot more questions than any answers. And it feels important not to resolve these too quickly and to sit with the uncomfortableness. So I present you with the following questions. How might codes of conduct and safety policies be rewritten so that trans and non-binary people of color are treated as the primary rights holders and experts on harm rather than as exceptions to a neutral norm? My second question I posed would be, what would it mean to redesign washroom seating and surveillance practices if the starting question were, where will trans and non-binary people of color feel safest and most autonomous, rather than what will make most patrons most comfortable? Third question, how can libraries restructure staffing, training, and governance so that the labor of naming and addressing trans misogyny and racism does not fall primarily on trans and racialized staff, but is understood as a core institutional responsibility? And I'll leave you with this final question. In light of Tuck and Yang's warning against metaphorizing decolonization, how can harm reduction models for gender diverse patrons be linked to broader commitments to Indigenous sovereignty and resistance to carceral control rather than folded into generic diversity initiatives?